The Vorathi researcher explained, in careful translation, that I should feel free to express my fear response. That was how the whole thing started. Not with a threat, not with a show of force, with a polite, clinical invitation to be afraid on their schedule. I'd been posted to Kelrath Station for 11 months by then. Drevos 4 is about what you'd expect from a survey moon in the contested outer belt. Gray rock, thin atmosphere, no view worth mentioning. The station itself was a prefab stack of 4 modules bolted to a basalt shelf, and my job was to catalog any xenotech debris the survey drones flagged in the surrounding crater fields. Unglamorous work. I'd done it on 3 other moons before this one. You develop a routine. The Vorathi ship arrived on day 312 of my posting, and I will say this for them. They did not waste time. Within 6 hours of orbital insertion, I had a translated message on my comm board, informing me that Kelrath Station sat inside a designated Vorathi observational study zone, that my presence was noted and tolerated as a minor variable, and that I should not interfere with any equipment I might encounter in the coming days. Minor variable. I filed that one for later. I did not reply. There was no question in the message, and I have never been one to fill silences that don't need filling. I went back to my cataloging. The device showed up the next morning. It was sitting on the basalt shelf outside the station's north airlock when I ran my 0600 external check. A matte black sphere, roughly the size of a cantaloupe, resting in a shallow tripod cradle that had not been there at 2200 the night before. No footprints in the rock dust. No disturbance on any of my perimeter sensors. It had simply appeared. I photographed it from the airlock camera for about 20 minutes before I went out. The sphere was warm to the touch through my glove, not hot, warm. The specific warmth of something running internal processes. The cradle was a passive stand, nothing to it. The sphere had a faint seam running equatorially that I could feel but not see. No obvious controls, no markings I could read. I set it on the workbench in Module 2 and took my coffee. At 0800, the message arrived. The researcher, I came to think of him as the lead, though his actual rank in the Vorathi Institute hierarchy involved a lens count on his optical band that I was never fully briefed on, explained, through the translator's careful approximation of his clicks and harmonic bursts, that I had encountered a standard Vorathi cognitive response stimulus unit. He said the device was designed to produce a calibrated sequence of sensory signals, infrasound at specific frequencies, low-level electromagnetic variance, thermal pulse, and a mild optical interference pattern. He said these stimuli had been validated across 47 non-Vorathi species to produce reliable fear responses, disorientation, and withdrawal behavior. He said they were looking forward to observing my responses over the next 48 hours. He asked me not to touch the device. I looked at the device. It was already on my workbench. I had already touched it. I told him I understood, and I thanked him for the briefing. I meant the thank you. The technical rundown was genuinely useful. He did not reply to that. Around hour 2, sitting at my cataloging desk with the sphere on the bench 3 meters away, I noticed the pressure behind my eyes that usually means a migraine coming on, then a low-frequency vibration in my back teeth, then a quality of light in Module 2 that was difficult to pin down. Nothing wrong with it, exactly, but wrong adjacent. My skin registered a slow oscillation between slightly too warm and slightly too cool. My vision at the edges of the bench did something that I can only describe as hesitating. It was, objectively, unpleasant. I have felt worse. 11 months on Drevos 4, with a malfunctioning CO2 scrubber in Module 3, will recalibrate your threshold for unpleasant. After about 4 hours, the infrasound component cycled down for what I assumed was a rest interval. I used the interval to eat lunch, review my drone log, and pull my xenotech field kit from the storage locker. I want to be clear about something else. This was not defiance. I am not, by nature, a defiant person. What I am, by training and 11 years of practice, is a xenotech field specialist. My job is to encounter devices of non-human manufacture and understand them. That is the entire job. Finding one, running an active test sequence on my own workbench was, professionally speaking, a significant opportunity. When the second cycle started at hour 5, I was already in gloves and eye protection, with a diagnostic tablet running a passive EM scan. The sphere's seam opened when the second cycle hit full amplitude. Not dramatically, a hairline gap, about 40 degrees of the equatorial line, revealing a dim amber interior. I could see the resonance coil array from the gap. 6 paired coils in a hexagonal arrangement around a central driver. The design was elegant, considerably more elegant than it needed to be for the stated function, which suggested the Varathy Institute's engineering division and their observational division operated on different budgets. I spent the next 3 hours mapping the EM output against the coil activation sequence. By hour 8, I had a reasonable model of how the device was producing the infrasound component and the thermal pulse. The optical interference was a function of the EM field interacting with the module's lighting panels. Passive, not a built-in emitter. Interesting constraint. I noted it. The device had a problem. Coil 4 in the hexagonal array was running about 12% hot compared to its pair. Not dramatically hot, nothing that would cause a failure, but enough to introduce a phase variance that was smearing the infrasound band roughly 8 Hz wider than the other coil's output suggested was intended. Sloppier than the rest of the design warranted. It had the look of a production fault that had slipped past final inspection. I flagged it in my notes and kept mapping. The Varathy checked in at hour 12. The lead's message was brief. Had I experienced any disorientation? Any elevated distress indicators? He noted that their sensors were reading unusual EM activity around the station and asked whether I was malfunctioning. I told him I was functioning normally. I told him the device was functioning and that I had identified a minor fault in the 4th resonance coil that he might want to address before the next field deployment. I included my EM scan data as an attachment. There was a longer pause than usual before his reply came. He said that the device was not to be interfered with. I told him I hadn't interfered with it. I'd observed it. I said the scan data was free of charge. Another pause. He said that I should be experiencing significant psychological distress. I told him the infrasound was producing a mild tooth sensitivity effect and that the thermal cycling was mildly irritating, but that on balance it ranked somewhere below the time the station's water reclaimer had backed up for a week in month 4. I said if his research team wanted a fuller comparison, I was happy to write it up. No reply. I went to sleep at 2200, standard routine. The device ran its cycles through the night. I have slept through worse. The second check-in came at hour 20. I was mid-disassembly by then, coil housing open, secondary winding exposed under the bench lamp, and I nearly missed the alert. The lead's message arrived with an urgency flag I hadn't seen from him before. His sensors, he said, were now showing that the device had been opened. He wanted to confirm that I had not damaged the unit. He said the word damaged twice, in 2 different harmonic registers that the translator reproduced both times with careful fidelity, and I noted that something had shifted in the phrasing, less clinical, more pointed. He also asked, with what I can only describe as effortful restraint, what I was doing with the micro-adjustment tool his external sensors had apparently been tracking since hour 18. I told him I had the secondary winding of coil 4 exposed and was preparing to correct the axial misalignment. I told him the winding would be returned to spec and the housing reseated before the 48-hour window closed. I told him the unit would run cleaner afterward than it had on arrival. He replied in under a minute. He said the device was Institute property and that I was not authorized to perform maintenance on Institute property. I told him I wasn't billing him. There was a pause considerably longer than any of the previous ones, long enough that I finished the realignment, ran the post-correction EM check, closed the housing, and had time to make a fresh entry in my diagnostic log before the next message appeared on the board. He asked, and I want to quote the translation accurately here, because the phrasing stayed with me, whether I had encountered many Varathy instruments during my posting. I told him this was the first. He said that was what he had assumed. I did not ask him what he meant by that. Some things land cleaner without the follow-up. By hour 30, I had a full disassembly diagram of the sphere's internal architecture drafted on my tablet. The coil array, the driver, the power cell. A compact and reasonably clever design. Nothing that would have surprised a mid-career human engineer, but solid work. The Vorathi had clearly been building these for a long time and had refined the tolerances down to something close to production perfect, the Coil 4 variants notwithstanding. I noted that the power cell architecture shared a conceptual approach with a passive thermal accumulator I had serviced on Drevos 2 3 years prior. Different manufacture, same underlying logic. Constraints tend to converge. Physics doesn't care who does the engineering. The question of whether to fix it was not one I spent much time on. I fix things. It is what I do. I had the Coil 4 housing open by hour 31. The fault was a fractional misalignment of the secondary winding, less than a millimeter off axis, which was enough to generate the phase variance at operating temperature. I realigned it with the micro-adjustment tool from my xenotech kit, verified the correction against the EM output, and closed the housing. The sphere ran a self-check cycle. All 6 coils came up matched within 2%. Cleaner than it had ever run, probably. I polished the casing. It had picked up some dust from the workbench, and set it back in the cradle. Then I took a sheet of my station log paper and wrote out the fault description, the correction I'd made, the tool used, and the post-correction EM readings. I folded the note and tucked it into the cradle bracket, where it would be found during retrieval. The 48-hour window closed at 0600 on day 2. At 0605, a Vorathi retrieval drone collected the sphere from the shelf. I watched it go on the external camera. The lead's call came 4 hours later. Not a message this time. A direct communication request. I accepted it. He did not open with a question. He opened with what the translator rendered as a long, syntactically complex statement that, as best I could reconstruct it, expressed the formal position of the Vorathi Observational Institute, that the events of the preceding 48 hours fell outside the parameters of any recognized specimen response category in their database. He said their instrument log showed the device had been disassembled, internally modified, and reassembled during an active test sequence. He said the written note was currently being analyzed by 3 separate research divisions, and that preliminary consensus was that it constituted an unprecedented event in the Institute's 200-year observational history. He paused. He asked, with what the translator flagged as genuine uncertainty, what I had been doing. I told him I'd been doing my job. He asked what my job was. I told him I was a xenotech field specialist. I told him that my job was to encounter devices of non-human manufacture, understand how they worked, and document anything that needed attention. I told him the Coil 4 fault had been a straightforward fix, and that he was welcome to the EM data if his engineering division wanted to run a quality audit on the production batch. The pause that followed was long enough that I got up and refilled my coffee. When he came back, he asked, and I could hear something unfamiliar in the translation, a harmonic the software usually smoothed out but left in this time, something that had no clean human equivalent, but landed somewhere between professional humiliation and the specific dismay of a person who has just understood that their entire experimental model needs to be rebuilt. He asked whether all humans did this. I thought about it for a moment. The survey drones humming in Module 1, the gray rock outside, the frost on the basalt shelf where the cradle had sat. I told him most of us did, with unfamiliar machinery, that it was fairly standard. He thanked me for the fault log. I told him the coil alignment should hold, but that he might want to tighten the secondary winding spec at the manufacturing stage if he was running these units at high duty cycles. That kind of misalignment tends to recur under thermal stress. I went back to cataloging. The Vorathi ship left orbit 2 days later. I filed the whole interaction under xenotech encounter, non-adversarial, and sent the EM scan data to the Institute's forwarding address as a courtesy copy. The lead never replied to that one. I still have the disassembly diagram. It is a good piece of work, honestly. I keep meaning to write it up properly,